Hi, everyone. Welcome. I know some people are still trickling in, so I'm just going to get started with my intro while a few more folks tune in. First off, thanks for joining us today. This is the very first live stream session of Ag on Air, and we're super glad that everyone's here. We're excited to continue Ag in this new exciting format, but we will keep the same mission, which for the past 3 years of Ag has been all about informing, inspiring, and connecting people globally through topics including data science, machine learning, and AI. My name is Lynn Heidman. I'm the head of content at Dataiku, and I'm honored to introduce our first Ag on Air speaker, Kathy O'Neill. She'll be talking about building machine learning models in a changing world. This is something that I think is top of mind for all data professionals today, and I personally am super excited to hear her speak about it. Before I turn it over to Kathy, just a short word about some of her accomplishments. Kathy O'Neill is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Weapons of Math Destruction: How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy, which was also a semifinalist for the National Book Award. And if you haven't read it, highly recommend it. Buy from your local bookstore. She's a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and founded the company Orca, which is an algorithmic auditing company. She's earned a PhD in math from Harvard, was a postdoctoral fellow in the MIT Math Department, and a professor at Barnard College, where she published a number of research papers in algorithmic algebraic geometry. She has an impressive list of other accomplishments, but we don't have that much time, and I know you're all ready to have me stop and to get on with it. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Kathy.
Thank you so much. Just gonna full screen myself here. Okay. So thank you for inviting me. And I've been told that we're going to be as positive as possible, although that's not what I'm known for. So I'm going to definitely end on a high note, but I guess my suggestion would be to be prepared for a little bit of bad news first. So I think of machine learning as something that needs to be handled with care and not to be blindly trusted. And I'll tell you why. In addition to working in finance during the credit crisis of 2007 and 8, I then left to work in data science, in internet startups, and I started building algorithms that were deciding between who got what on the internet. So sort of, if you will, segregating people into people that deserved offers and people who didn't. And what I realized was that I was in many ways contributing to something that could go just as badly as what I'd seen happen in finance. In fact, I coined a term for these algorithms that were quite bad. I called them weapons of math destruction. So I want to start with the definition of weapons of math destruction. They're important algorithms. I call them high impact, which is to say, like, they affect a lot of people. They're secret, they're opaque. They're almost always scoring systems. So like you should think each person is scored and they're decided, like each person is decided whether it's like they're worthy of something, some opportunity, like a job or a credit card or some loan or something, or a good insurance policy. But they don't understand. So it's a high impact in that sense, like they're important decisions, but they're also like scored in these secret ways that people don't understand. And they're also unfair. So these, at least from my perspective, the algorithms I was building that was scoring people are often sort of just going along things like, how much money do you have? Like, are you a man or a woman? Like, what's your socioeconomic situation? And like, possibly, what is your race? And yet they were sort of being run everywhere all the time and having a lot of impact. I was really worried about them, so I wrote a book. And I've been thinking about them now almost 7 years. What I've realized it's really important to distinguish between different contexts. So an algorithm a scoring system that is good in one context could be bad in another. The example I like to give is health risk scores. If there is a scoring system that decided whether somebody is going to get diabetes in the next 3 years, that might be really great for your doctor to have, because your doctor could keep track of your A1C levels and decide, we should, really pay attention to your health, and they would therefore avoid you getting diabetes. But it could be really evil if like an insurance company had that same algorithm and force you to like score yourself, and then decided not to offer you insurance because you are likely to be expensive. So the same algorithm could be bad or good depending on the context. And most of the time algorithms are like that. They're not inherently evil, but they could be used for evil purposes. The second thing is that there's really a difference between talking about sort of what could go wrong for the individual and what can go wrong systemically. Another way of thinking about that is like, if you were denied a job by an algorithm, it would be really difficult for you to prove that the algorithm is fundamentally flawed or statistically flawed. It could have even made a mistake for you. It could have unfairly denied you a job. But you might not be able to make, in fact, you wouldn't be able to make, just on the basis of what happened to you, any kind of sort of statistical claim like it's racist or what have you. And the problem with that, as we'll see, is that it's really difficult for any individual to ferret out systemic problems. Systemic problems are not recognizable from the individual perspective. So we'll come back to that. The final thing is feedback loops are really hugely important in this context. So what I'm suggesting is, and we'll see this for each example I give, that the weapons of math destruction that I discovered in my research weren't just bad for the people that were targeted, but they created negative feedback loops, destructive feedback loops. So I'm going to come back to that too, because I want to show you some examples. And there's 5 examples here. And in the next slide after this, I'm going to show you that they're all different problems. So there's lots of problems that algorithms can run into. And yes, just to take a step up, like I am focusing on problems. And that's in some sense what I do. But in another sense, like, because for the most part, you're going to hear about how great algorithms are because people are trying to sell you their algorithms. I'm not trying to sell you an algorithm. And so I'm going to focus on what could go wrong rather than how miraculous things are. I don't really think algorithms are miraculous most of the time. So here's 5 problems. They're all examples of what I call weapons of math destruction. At least there are specific algorithms that are like this. The first one was this sort of teacher accountability tool called the value-added model, VAM. So teachers were being fired based on this system, which was a number that was told to them months after their year ended, their teaching year. This is like high school or junior high or middle school public school teachers. And the idea was like, we're going to get rid of the bad teachers so that our achievement gap would get smaller. I mean, it was a very like weird idea that just by scoring a teacher from a number 1 to 100, they're going to be able to figure out who's a good teacher and who's a bad teacher. The problem in this case was that it wasn't picking up real information, and I wasn't able to prove that myself. I tried to get my access to the source code, but I wasn't given that access, even though a journalist was given access to all the scores of all the teachers in New York City. This was being done nationwide, by the way, mostly in urban school systems. And then a high school math teacher in New York City, like what he did something brilliant. He looked at that now publicly available information about who the teachers and what their scores were, and he just discovered that lots of teachers had 2 scores. And not just 2 scores, but 2 scores for the same subject in the same year. Now, ideally, this was supposed to be saying like, you know, if you had a 20 out of 100, you're a bad teacher. If you have an 80 out of 100, you're a good teacher. So they're supposed to be like just saying the same answer, like answering the same question is a better way of saying it. So he plotted all those teachers. So each dot here represents a teacher with 2 scores for the same subject in the same year. So supposedly these are supposed to be the same number if they were really asking the question, are you a good teacher or not? But as you can see, when you plot it out like this on a scatter plot, it was almost randomly distributed, which actually implies that the underlying value-added model, the algorithm that assigns these numbers to teachers, were almost a random number generator. It was almost information-free. This is what I would call a sort of one picture audit of the algorithm that sort of proves that it is just too random to be used to fire teachers or not, but yet it was used to fire a bunch of teachers. So that's the first example of a value-added model. Is high impact, secret, by the way, the teachers weren't explained how these scores were created, and it was destructive. It was unfair because it was essentially a random number generator, and unlucky people just got fired. The second example, which I think it's become pretty famous since my book came out, is the example of predictive policing, where you have basically you have a bunch of location data for arrests, sort of put into a system of put into a map, and then the heat map is sort of created. So predictive policing is sometimes more complicated than this, but often just comes down to a heat map of where did arrests take place recently. And what the idea is like, oh, well, we could just have this map in every police station that shows us where the bad guys are. And then we can assign more patrol officers to those areas where we're seeing a lot of crime. A little bit further downstream from that sort of initial thing about where are the arrests, we have something called recidivism risk algorithms. And this was not for scoring a neighborhood for its crime rate, but scoring individuals for their chances of getting rearrested after leaving prison. And those risk algorithms, so they were sometimes called crime risk scores, they've also gotten a lot of attention recently. So some of you might have heard of it. They were supposed to sort of decide who is going to reoffend. And the idea was for people who are going to reoffend, we're going to keep them in prison longer. We're going to deny them parole. We're going to keep them incarcerated before trial, that kind of thing. So in both cases, with the predictive policing and the crime risk scores, what the idea was, on the basis of like your chances of getting arrested or people in this neighborhood getting arrested, we're going to sort of punish you. We're going to send more cops there, or we're going to keep you in prison longer. So they're both kind of punitive. And that's really important because these, as I said earlier, it's all about context, but it's also all about that feedback loop that I told you about. Because as you can see, if you send police to the neighborhood where you're like, oh, there's lots of bad guys there, then you're going to do more arrests there because more police are there, and you're going to sort of continue this feedback loop of sending more and more police to that same neighborhood over and over again. That's a feedback loop that you're creating, or you're continuing rather, because it's actually has a lot of history. Similarly, with recidivism risk algorithms, my claim is that because of the nature of imprisonment and prison in our country, by keeping people in prison longer, we are not actually improving their chances of not getting arrested afterwards. In other words, we are improving their chances of being rearrested and staying in prison. It's sort of like another feedback loop, a pernicious feedback loop of high scores actually cause people to get more disattached from their communities and more likely to be rearrested. So there's another pernicious feedback loop. I think underlying both of these examples, though, what I really want to draw your attention to is the problem with them is that we don't actually have crime data. So I have this the second picture here. In the case of I'm just looking at arrests versus crime for the specific crime category of marijuana use. What we see on the left is that we see that white and black people smoking pot at similar rates. Whereas on the right, you see that black people get arrested for smoking pot at 3 or 4 or 5 times the rate. And that's true over time. It's true over geography. There are some places where it's even worse, some places where it's a little bit better than that ratio. But the point I'm trying to make is that when we use arrests as a proxy for crime, we're not doing a good job. And most statisticians would realize that they should not pretend that we have perfect data when we actually have a bias of 3 to 1 across races. So that is the problem there. I'll come back to that. And I'm sorry I have to keep flipping through these pictures, but I have to go back to this list of examples of weapons of mass destruction. The fourth type of WMD that I outline in my book is hiring algorithms. And in particular, I talked in my book about this young man named Kyle Beam, who was rejected from a job which he was highly qualified for, which is basically bagging groceries at a grocery store, where they were using a personality test in order to filter people who applied for this job. And within that personality test, they had embedded a 5-factor model mental health assessment, which he failed because he had bipolar disorder, which had been treated, by the way. This is illegal to sort of give someone a mental health exam as part of a job description, sort of a job interview. So it's actually illegal to do this, but it was in fact being done. And it wasn't just being done for this one job for this one guy. Like, he actually applied to 7 different like big box stores in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And all of them were using exactly the same personality test. So it was highly scaled. Anybody who had like bipolar disorder that took one of those tests would be rejected, not just for that one job, but for any of the outlets of those big box stores, including things like Taco Bell and Kroger's grocery store and others, and Lowe's. So that's the high impact there. That is the feedback loop there is that, once you are rejected, once an entire subpopulation, by the way, it's illegal under the Americans with Disability Act, and the ADA was built to avoid this particular problem, which is like an entire subpopulation being denied employment, which is clearly its own feedback loop, its own pernicious feedback loop. Once people are denied employment, they don't have employment history, they can't get a job, et cetera. So I just want to keep drawing our attention to, it's not just bad at the moment, it sort of creates this destructive feedback loop. The final example I want to talk about for a WMD is what I talk about with political ads at the end, that we are, and this is so in the news, I would be surprised if you haven't heard about this, but political ads, because of the technology and the ecosystem of online advertising, has just become extremely easy to give manipulative, emotional-based, pseudo-scientific, possibly unscientific information. But moreover, and what I focus on is just that it's so tailored to the individual that they could literally be saying like something to the same campaign, I should say, could be saying like something to one person and then the opposite to the next person. And it would be really difficult to keep track of what they're saying to different people and whether those things even contradict each other. But beyond like something that is super just false, like what I just described, what I think really is true and is also bad for democracy is the fact that they know more about you than you know about them. So any particular candidate, and this might not be as true for presidential candidates who, after all, we scrutinize at a national level all the time, but local candidates can figure out through your profile like all of your issues, like what are the issues that you care about and which ones, how do you feel about them? And they can choose the one thing that they know you'll agree with, even if like 20 other things you disagree with and are important to you even. But they'll figure out the one thing that you do agree with the candidate on, and they'll just push that towards you as if that's the only thing that matters. So there's really very little kind of research you can do at this point on the internet about a candidate that hasn't been attached to your name and to your profile. So even if you go to a candidate's website, they're going to know who you are and they're going to show you what they want you to see. That is not really good for democracy. So I just want to go to my next slide, and I just want to make the point that different things have gone wrong in these different examples. So the first thing was the teacher one. It was just random numbers generator. It was a bad statistic, and that should never have been used. The fact that that value-added model for teachers was used is an example of how we just have no standards, if you will, for what it means to be good enough or accurate enough or informational in that field. And in fact, it was basically impossible to get the source code to that. And this was the only kind of audit I've ever seen of it. So it's just bad statistics and should not happen, but there still isn't any actual rule that prevents it from happening again. Policing, as I suggested, is about missing data. I told you about sending cops back to where there are previous arrests. And I also showed you that arrests do not mean crime. There's a lot of crime that does not lead to an arrest. Just think about rape. There's just way underreporting for rape, and even the reported rape only leads to an arrest 7% of the time by one count. So there's so much missing data that I think like data scientists should just refuse to do work with arrest data. At least they should refuse to acknowledge it as crime data. They should stop talking about it as crime data. They should talk about it as policing data. And if you do that, of course, you are predicting the police pretty well. Sometimes I call predictive policing predicting the police, because you are predicting where the police are going to go by looking at where they've been doing arrests. But that doesn't mean that's where they should go. Another way of thinking about this is, if after the financial crisis we had sent all the police down to Wall Street to arrest the bankers, then the crime data, the so-called crime data, the arrest data, i.e., would show us that all the crime was happening on Wall Street. But we didn't do that. Like, we made a social choice to just continue sending the police to Harlem to arrest young boys. In recidivism, which is that crime risk score, of course, there's missing data there too, but I also think it's just the wrong question. If you go into the details of recidivism, then they always refer to it as reoffending. What they really should call it is rearresting. And they're asking the question, and the algorithm is optimized to the wrong question, which is, who is likely to be rearrested? But as I said, since the police have a profiling, like a race problem and a poverty, they basically profile poor people and Black people. We shouldn't be asking who's going to be profiled by the police, and can we punish those people now? That's the wrong question. What we'd like to be asking, of course, is like, who is going to commit another violent crime? We don't have enough data. We don't have enough predictive power to answer that question. So instead of acknowledging that we cannot actually predict violent crime, we just end up profiling poor Black people, people with addiction, people with mental health disorders, and saying those people are much more likely to be rearrested. And in some sense, that's true. They are more likely to be rearrested, but we have to ask ourselves, why are they more likely to be rearrested? Should we be doing better for people who have addiction problems, who have mental health problems, who are poor? I like to think of this recidivism risk algorithm as the most fundamental mirror back to ourselves as to what we are doing wrong. So again, going back to the context question, how can we flip the context so that instead of using that as a punitive thing to punish people who are already very likely to be rearrested, we could ask ourselves, why are these people so much more likely to be rearrested just because they have mental health problems or addiction problems? With respect to hiring, well, I gave the example with the ADA case of like having a mental health exam intentionally embedded into the hiring algorithm. But there's other hiring algorithms that have a different problem, like the Amazon example, where they were trying to predict who would be a good engineer at Amazon based on their own data. And they found that the algorithm that they built from their own data was sexist. And that is a different kind of problem, which it's bias. The data itself showed that they preferred men for things that indicate success, like raises and promotions and probably year-end reports. So there's bias problems too. And then with politics, I'd argue that the problem here, the reason that it becomes a weapon of mass destruction, is that there's literally too much data. We have too much information about ourselves floating around. This is kind of goes to the question of privacy a little bit. Well, let me take that back. If there's anybody in the Q&A section that wants me to talk a little bit about privacy and why I think about privacy differently, then let's leave that for then. But I'd argue that at least there's too much data that is allowable to be used by political campaigns. My argument would be that we should have a restriction on what kind of data could be used in politics. So in particular, if there was a rule tomorrow that Facebook imposed, because Facebook is basically the purveyor of these political ads, if Facebook tomorrow imposed a rule that political ads had to be randomly shown to people, like random, instead of saying, I want this to be shown to white women in Iowa, between the ages of 45 and 55, which is what we do now, instead saying like, oh, show this at random to the general population on Facebook, that would be a lot better. It would solve a lot of the problems that I think are degrading our democracy with political ads. So those are problems that I have witnessed, I have brought up. I don't want to seem completely negative though, because I do think we can do a lot better. And so I want to introduce you to something I call the stakeholder matrix. Sometimes I call it the ethical matrix. And what it's broadly doing, and this is a tool I want you guys to use when you're designing. It doesn't actually have to be an algorithm, to be honest. It's just any kind of decision-making system that's, especially if it's automatic. So you should ask yourself, is this algorithm working? Well, I mean, actually, whenever I ask somebody, does your algorithm work? They always say yes. And then I say, well, what does it mean to work? And they're like, well, it means it's accurate or it's efficient or something like that. And then I'm like, well, for whom does it work? And for whom does it fail? So the idea of the stakeholder matrix is it is supposed to answer this question more broadly, expand our notion of what it means for something to work. And in particular, add all the stakeholders in who are being affected. That's why it's called the stakeholder matrix. I'm going to show you an example in a second. And I just want to make sure that you understand that I'm not saying this is a solution. It doesn't solve the problems that your algorithm raises. It just shows you what to worry about. And that's at best, because what it really does is it reflects a conversation that you're having about who might be affected and how they might be affected. A different conversation would show you a different matrix. So here's a case study I have in the world of credit. Now, what I'm going to do, hopefully, with this example, is I'm going to confuse you and then clarify myself. The idea is we have a relatively complicated paper, which I think is brilliant, by the way, and worth the time it takes to read, by Moritz Hart and others, called Equality of Opportunity in Supervised Learning. It's an academic paper, so it's hard to read. But the idea is asking the question, what would it cost a company, a credit company, so a company that extends credit like loans to consumers, what would it cost them to be non-racist? That's the sort of high level question. And by the way, that's just an appendix of this paper, but that's what I'm talking about. What would it cost to be non-racist? And one of the things that we learned from the ongoing national conversation about race, and in particular about these crime risk scores that was started by ProPublica, by the way, is that we don't have a definition of racist algorithms. We don't have a single definition. So what Moritz Hart and his colleagues do in this paper is they sort of suggest 5 different definitions of racist credit algorithms. And they measure the cost of each of those definitions. And this is a sort of one of the pictures they have in their paper, in their appendix, that shows you, like, depending on how strict your definition of racist is, and demography is the most strict, and then it becomes less and less, it's going to cost you more or less from your sort of optimized, most profitable algorithm. And I won't explain this fully, because the point isn't to understand the details of this. The point is, well, the high level point is to realize that credit companies, fintech companies aren't going to take on any definition of racist or non-racism by choice. They're going to have to be imposed. That will have to be a rule that's imposed by regulators, because any definition of racism that they take as a constraint to their algorithm will cost them money. So, and moreover, if only one of them is doing it and the others aren't, then that one company is sort of taking a hit where the other companies aren't imposing that restriction to themselves. So that would be sort of difficult to imagine that a for-profit company is going to be like, I volunteer to make less money so that I can be less racist. They have to sort of all be told they have to do the same thing at the same time. That is my belief anyway, having worked at a hedge fund. And by the way, if you want to know what my long-term goal is, it's to help the regulators figure out which definition of racism they should take for these different kinds of rules in different industries like credit or insurance. Anyway, so that's the sort of picture I have for you. What is the stakeholder matrix I want to draw your attention to? Well, first I'm going to show you what I call the standard ethical matrix or standard stakeholder matrix, which is just like you ask the company, hey, is your algorithm working? And they're like, yes. And you're like, how do you know? And they say, because it's really profitable. And you're like, oh, okay. We want to know more than that. We want to know what could go wrong and for whom. And so here is the revised standard stakeholder matrix, also known as ethical matrix, where as you see the rows and the columns have multiplied. The rows now are the different stakeholders, and you have the company, of course, matters, but also the customers matter, but also the customers are different types of customers. You have minority customers and you have white customers. And what this appendix does is it figures out that their concerns, which are the columns, there's some of them are really problematic and some of them are fine. And so problematic issues I call red, and fine issues I call green, and yellow issues are like maybe problematic. And what you're supposed to take away from this is that minority customers in particular, that row, has concerns, and they're real, and their concerns are about fairness, and to be more precise, they're about false negatives. So what I'm trying to get across is that the false negative rate for minority customers is much higher than for white customers. Why? Well, that's the last column. The data quality for minority customers is a lot worse. So minority customers, there is data about them, but it's actually not good. By the way, we could, in a different conversation, to clarify, in a different conversation, we could have more columns, more rows. We could have different concerns. This is supposed to be a reflection that I wrote, the reflection of the appendix that I'm referring to. It wouldn't actually be the ethical matrix I would draw around credit extension to minority and white customers. But this is the idea, is that you translate sort of the brass tacks of the larger conversation is translated into one picture. And what you can do is you can look for the red boxes and say, what is that problem? How can I address it? So it's sort of if you will, a way of elevating the conversation from technical, which is hard to understand and hard to talk about, to a sort of values-based, ethical conversation around like, what is the thing we need to worry about? Minority customers are afraid of falsely being denied loans because of bad data quality. I hope that makes sense. Okay, well, I don't have a lot of time and I do want to get to question and answer. So I promised that I would talk about what I think will go wrong in this changing world. And of course, I'm going to end on a high note. So if you see at the very little ball at the end says what will go right, I promise I will say that. But I first want to take a use case, a case study from education. And I do have to admit that I'm not particularly positive at this particular moment, just because there's been so many examples just in the last couple of months of what can go wrong with algorithms in education. And I don't think that education is special because it's what I really think. I don't think that other industries are going to be less problematic. I think education is special because it is more obvious, and it's more obvious because students talk to each other and they all get graded, and they all, it's like a very sort of public and obvious set of examples. So in some sense, the transparency is what makes education special. So the first thing I want to talk about is admissions, which are already done pretty algorithmically. There are usually algorithms that sort of rate students trying to get into college. That's sort of historically been true, but I think it's going to be supercharged now because colleges are losing a lot of money, and they're going to have to fire a lot of people in their administration, and they're going to be leaning much more heavily on the algorithms. For that matter, the SAT has now fallen out of favor, but we haven't heard what the replacement is going to be. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be better than the SAT. I mean, I'm not going to defend the SAT. It's historically racist and classist, but I don't know what is going to replace it. Financial aid is something that has historically been part of like a sort of awkward part of admissions, because the admissions officers have to balance the sort of population of students that can pay full tuition versus the students that need financial aid, but the kind of information they can get on who might need financial aid, it has been, again, put into super drive by the kind of surveillance that admissions officers can now commit on students who are like browsing the websites of the college. There's like this this company that will, if you allow it, and if you pay it, it will sort of sit on the website of a college and sort of measure how much time students dwell on the financial aid information page of your college, so that they can sort of compose a score, it's always a score, of students to see like how much money they might ask for and how much they might be able to pay. Along those lines, I built two different algorithms, two different stakeholder matrices for college admissions. And in this, these are actually two different kinds of admissions algorithms. The first one is the standard one. Like when I say standard, I mean like what we've all taken as standard is like the real goal of admissions and the real goal of administration in colleges is to sort of improve the U.S. News and World Report ranking of the college. And what you'll see there, just by sort of tracking where the red boxes are, that the public is becoming more and more skeptical of the objectivity of, they just think, okay, just like rich kids get in because they cheat and get this tutoring and it's bad for social mobility, not to mention that students are paying more and more for these colleges that are sort of going all out trying to improve their ranking without actually improving their education. So it's an expensive endeavor, and the cost falls on the students and their parents. And then the lower stakeholder matrix refers to a totally different approach to admissions, which is very unusual. But I do always want to point it out because I think it's more, at least from the perspective of the public, it's a lot better. So you see the public has green all across. Whereas administrators and faculty don't. What is this approach? This is called the UT Austin model for admissions, where by the Constitution of Texas, the state of Texas, the UT Austin and the other state schools, I believe, just accept students. I think the rule is the top 7% of all students from every high school get automatically admitted to UT Austin. So that's a very different approach, and it's a nod towards the fact that different high schools have different kinds of poverty issues and racist issues, like as we know is true for all of the country. But in Texas, they're just like, well, no matter what, you're a good kid at this school, you get into the good school. And as you can imagine, the social mobility for that is absolutely out of the world compared to, everyone trying to get into Harvard and everyone trying to get into a top ranked U.S. News and World Report college. Also, the cost is quite low compared to those kinds of schools. I just want to dwell on this for a second because I really think higher education is going to go through a huge transformation, and admissions in particular, and I think we need to do it in a different way. And I would just like to keep in mind that the UT Austin system is a really reasonable system. Here's another reasonable system: random numbers. Okay, so that's my little opinion about admissions. But I'm also concerned about the algorithms that tell people which classes to take. I call it instruction by algorithm. Well, first of all, who gets to be online and who gets to be in person? We're seeing this already happening through COVID and quarantine. Like, it is absolutely increasing inequality. We're seeing much more online learning for poor kids, and what's worse, a lot of poor kids that don't have good internet, whereas richer kids get to go in person with lots more resources. That is, in some sense, unavoidable at this moment, but like the question is, in a long-term way, what's going to happen? But that's sort of before we even get to the algorithms, although the online learning itself can be automated. What I worry about is when you get into college, you will be shunted, if you will, into majors and into classes that people like you manage to do. What do I mean by people like you? That's the kind of thing that I mean when I started talking about data science in general. Like, people like you spent money, so I'm going to offer you this deal. People like you didn't spend money, so I'm going to not offer you anything. But when we're profiling, when we're deciding what it means to be people like you, it's almost always done by race and gender and socioeconomic status. What I worry about here is that people who grew up in poor areas will only be offered classes and majors that will keep them poor. And I think that is quite likely, because historically speaking, that will be what it looks like, what worked for those people. But it's sort of the definition of success, again, is for colleges is more like graduation than it is you got a good job and you were successful in your career. So it's taking free will away from people. I also worry that because you're under surveillance the entire time you're in college, you are being sort of scored at every opportunity. Like you have a grit score. This, by the way, grit scores are real. I learned about them from people who do online learning algorithms at the high school and junior high school level. They do have something called grit score. What I worry about is that information is sold. Just imagine Facebook has a college and like sells people to the highest bidder along with their score, their grit score and their resiliency score and their GPA. Like, those are just metrics that we're going to get slapped with starting from kindergarten pretty soon. Not to mention that people who didn't end up graduating, which is a lot of people actually, will always have that kind of, if you will, like stigma attached to their digital record, which is already kind of true. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's kind of like the new FICO score. What I worry about is that you're going to have a sort of education FICO score. I also think that once we have instruction by algorithm and we have a lot of things online, the faculty, especially the tenured faculty, will be is kind of be the end of tenure, which it already kind of is. Finally, grading by algorithm. I don't know if you guys have been watching the news, but in the UK, they've had all these debacles around, like, instead of actually taking a test because of COVID, they just assigned people grades, and it was just a complete mess. And a lot of people were only admitted into college. This is for high school seniors. They were only admitted into college based on an assumed score for that final test. And since the score was so much lower, even though it wasn't a real test and it wasn't a real score, that got denied their college entrance. It's just a complete storm of what. Not to mention that there's other algorithms that, because all the instruction is done online and the homework is passed in online, the grading is done online. And there's been a bunch of news about people who've learned to game the grading algorithm by just putting keywords in for an essay, for example. Most of these algorithms that grade essays are very stupid. They basically just look for keywords. And give you more points, more keywords you have. So you could just do a Google search for keywords associated to this topic, throw that into your essay and get a perfect score. It's ridiculous. Of course, those algorithms are going to get better over time, but then cheating is going to get better too. And I suggest that we're going to have an arms race of algorithms. And then the question becomes like, well, if everyone's cheating and getting perfect scores, then what does it mean to get a grade? And what does it mean to have a graduation diploma? I mean, are you certified or not? To the extent that education is a certification, that you know stuff, that becomes a question, and it becomes a more and more urgent question the more things are gameable. And what I think, I'm sorry to bring up all these philosophical questions, but this is what happens when you think through these things. You need a sort of enormous ethical matrix or stakeholder matrix, and you have to ask yourself, what is education for? What could go wrong? What does it mean to succeed? For whom? Who are the stakeholders? Who needs those certificates? And what does it mean for a particular certificate to be authoritative and trusted? And I think it's not too hard, it's not too crazy to suggest that the very people that need the certificates the most of being educated are poor people, people of color, women, and the people, and they're exactly the people that are going to be shunted to online gameable systems where nobody trusts the certificate. So it's going to be a problem for the sort of the program of education. Okay, well, that's a use case, a case study, if you will, of what could happen, which I argued is sort of the same but worse. And I think I made that argument. But I do want to suggest that we have room to be hopeful in certain particular ways. First of all, I do think we've gotten over the era of blindly trusting algorithms. I think that there are enough people making enough noise, enough scholars, lots of women of color in particular, making enough noise about what could go wrong with algorithms, even Google search algorithms. If you look at Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, what could go wrong for algorithms that are foisted on poor people. If you look at Virginia Eubank's book, which I'm automating inequality. So we don't have the blind trust anymore. That's good. That's good. That means we'll have better discussions about what our explicit values are. That's the point of the stakeholder matrix, is to say, here's what we want, here's what we worry about, here's what we want to avoid. We will be checking our algorithms much more. And ideally, and this goes to the the grading algorithms in the UK, who is accountable for those mistakes? Nobody seemed to be accountable. That's going to change. I really think so. I think at some point, and it's soon, when some bureaucracy decides, instead of doing this by hand, we're doing it by humans, we're just going to replace ourselves with an algorithm. When that algorithm makes mistakes, those humans will be held accountable. I mean, at least that's my hope, and that is actually my belief as well. So I do think we have reason to hope. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. We did get a few really good questions during your presentation, so hopefully we'll have time for all of them. In the beginning of your presentation, we got a question from someone who is wondering, if we just don't train machines with bad data and exclude biased data, is that enough?
Great question. And that's exactly why I went to the trouble of explaining all the different ways things could go wrong. The answer is there is no one thing that we can do to solve this problem. Like, getting rid of biased data is a good idea. And it would, although, I mean, as a caveat, like, there is no such thing as debiasing data. Like, all data has bias. It's just that we have to be really careful and thoughtful about what kind of bias we consider okay and what kind of bias we consider inappropriate. So going back to the Amazon hiring algorithm, the fact that the algorithm to decide which engineer to hire was sexist was an example of biased data. Because of Amazon's actual data in their own system, we saw that for whatever reason, the women they hired weren't seen as successful. Was that because they were not given promotions or not given raises, or they didn't stay as long because the environment was nasty? Who knows? But I'm just saying, like, it's not completely obvious how to debias that. It doesn't even make sense to debias it. What it does make sense to do is say, this algorithm, if we're going to use it, cannot be sexist, and we have to define what it means to not be sexist. We have to be very explicit. It goes back to my explicit values. We have to be super explicit about what it means for us to have acceptable bias. Now, so that's just the answer to, like, whether debiasing will help. I mean, again, a caveat, which I don't really think debiasing makes sense, but setting an appropriate bias makes sense. That will still not solve the problem that we saw with the value-added model, where it was just a random number generator. Had nothing to do with bias data. The data could have been perfect, but the statistics was bad. So there's lots of different problems that could be happening. I've never seen any one approach be enough. And in fact, because I do algorithmic auditing for a living, I will add that there's almost always at least a few problems, and you have to address them in new and different tailored ways every time.
This next question actually kind of will be a continuation of what you were just saying, so it works out great. Especially in the work that you're doing with auditing, are there any companies who are doing things differently and that are actually taking initiative on these matters?
Yeah, there are. Most of them are under NDA for me, and I can't talk about all of them. But I guess a couple of them I can talk about. I worked with the Department of Licensing, which is kind of the DMV for Washington State, and they were like, we want you to audit our use of facial recognition software. And it's not perfect software. We know that from all the amazing work done by the Algorithmic Justice League and Joy Buolamwini and all those folks. We know that there's more errors for Black people and for women, for example, and it turns out for older people. But what we found by auditing them was that they were compensating for the problems of the underlying algorithm by having a really robust human oversight system, like many, many layers of oversight. So it's not impossible to make up for flawed algorithms on the one hand, and it's also not impossible for institutions to address it if they work hard at it. I will just add one last thing, which is that we see a lot of facial recognition bans in various cities. One of the things I learned doing that job is that the federal government basically mandates that every Department of Licensing or DMV of every state uses facial recognition. So this is not something that they could just choose not to do. They insist that they do something called Real ID. You guys might have heard about that. Real ID is something where you're like, if you don't have a Real ID by the end of 2021 or something, you won't be able to fly at all on commercial airlines. So these states are being told, the DMVs in particular, like if you don't use facial recognition, then you can't issue Real IDs and none of your citizens can fly. It's a real thing. So if people are interested in sort of being activist around facial recognition bans, they should really think this has to be an act of Congress to get rid of that particular rule.
Once again, you've segued right into my next question, which is, and you touched on this a little bit also in your presentation, but was hoping you could expand. In your opinion, what is the role of laws and regulation in the world of machine learning? Like, do we need it in order for things to happen? It sounds like the answer is yes, but.
Oh yeah, it absolutely do need it. So that was an example of a law that sort of mandates the use of AI, but I would argue that the point I was trying to make with the credit example is like, here's how much it costs to make sure you're not racist with respect to this definition or respect to that definition. Again, no credit company is going to voluntarily take on an extra constraint to their profit unless they are forced to. And right now, the situation is that most companies and most industries that use AI, which is a lot of them, any type of decision-based like insurance, credit, hiring, all those industries, like they are essentially like, catch me if you can. I'm not saying that they're all like that. There are obviously exceptions. But yeah, the regulators have to get on the ball. And I talked to many regulators. I mean, by the way, do we need laws? We already have laws. We don't need new laws sometimes. Sometimes we do, like we could talk about that. But like, I'm just talking about existing laws. The regulators who are in charge of existing laws do not know how to address them in the context of big data and AI. So like that is my mission right now, is like talking to regulators being like, yeah, that's definitely illegal. Like I can explain it to you. You guys need to enforce your laws.
Great. We have one person who was actually asking for the names of all of the reading list or the books that you mentioned. Maybe that's one where we can follow up and provide a list of resources that
I mentioned
people can.
Automating Inequality and Algorithms of Oppression, but I also wanted to mention Artificial Unintelligence and Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology, which is awesome. Yeah, I'll write them down for you and you can share.
Great. Yeah, we'll share that after a list of all the books that Kathy recommends on this subject. Do you have time for a few other questions, or
yeah, I got some more time.
Okay? This one is kind of in line with the first question, and it's a bit about the paradox of biased data. So machine learning models are built to recognize patterns, but in some domains, patterns themselves are problematic, like the examples you mentioned with recidivism and judges. Do you see this as an unsolvable paradox, or do you think that there is a path forward?
I don't think it's a paradox at all. I think it's the wrong question. As I said in my talk, it's two things. It's the wrong question, and then it's a intentional misdirection. So I think people are being intentionally misdirected by saying reoffend. Like reoffend is not what we're talking about. We're talking about rearrest. There's plenty of, as I say, there's so many people that commit crimes that don't get arrested, even with murders. Like only about half of murders lead to an arrest, and that's where you know there was a crime. There's just it's so the idea that it's like we're predicting crime is a mistake. We are predicting arrests. By the way, another example of why I know this is just the wrong question is that I had a opportunity to talk to an entire room full of federal judges about recidivism risk scores, and they didn't want to use them. There's two reasons they didn't want to use them. First of all, they felt like they were going to be judged themselves by those scores. And by the way, I think they're right. Just as teachers, I didn't tell you much about the value added model, but teachers are being judged by the way their students did on tests. I think judges could similarly be judged by the way their defendants are scored on these recidivism risk scores. So I do think that's an appropriate concern by the federal judges. In particular, they were worried that they would not be seen as tough enough on crime because they were they're appointed judges. And the second thing, which is related to the first, is that they said, this is the wrong question. If I see someone, and it was harrowing, I'm going to start crying. It was harrowing to talk to these federal judges about what they actually are dealing with. But the answer is opioid addiction. And they're like, if I see an opioid addict, of course, first of all, of course, they were also a dealer because that's what addiction does to you. But if I ask myself the question, is this person going to be rearrested? The answer is absolutely, because I cannot provide them with effective rehab. All I can do is punish them and decide how long they should be in prison before they go out and get more drugs. And so for them, it's like this question that the algorithm, the scoring system is answering is, will this person be rearrested? And if the answer is yes, I'm supposed to put them in prison longer. But if I'm looking at an addict, all I want to do is send them to a successful rehab. And that's going to be the opposite of the advice that's being given by the algorithm, which is what, again, goes back to why they don't want to be judged by how they rule relative to the algorithm scoring system. So long story short, it's the wrong question. Sometimes things are very predictable, like addiction or poverty or mental health problems. That doesn't mean you should punish people more for them. But that is what the scoring system is doing. So to answer, sorry, I'm answering this question so roundabout, but do I see is this unsolvable paradox? No, I think this is a huge mistake, a huge, terrible, terrible mistake. Is there a path forward? Absolutely. But it's going back to the question I asked about education. We have to ask ourselves, what is prison for? What does success look like when we're talking about prison? Does it look like we were right that you got rearrested? No, that shouldn't be satisfying to us that we caused someone to be rearrested by giving them a high score. This is what we're really doing now. Success should be rehabilitation, or educating somebody in prison and giving them a chance at a better life, or getting them a job. Those are the things that we should be optimizing for, and that's not what our scoring system does. So we could change our scoring system. It wouldn't just be that simple because judges ignore scoring systems. That's one of the things we've learned, by the way, is that these scoring systems are kind of ignored by judges, and that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to a very human question, like how do we as humans feel about these decisions? It's not about the machines at all in the end. It
is about human issues. That's why I'm suggesting stakeholder matrix first. Then once you have sorted out your human issues, your values, your ethics, ask the data scientist to translate that into code. The data scientist right now has the job of the ethicist and the de facto policymaker, etc. That's too much. Data scientists should just be like, tell me what your values are. Tell me how to measure those values. I'll turn that into code. That should be their only job. I say that as a data scientist. I'm being asked to do too much.
And you mentioned also a little bit earlier that you think that the people being held responsible for decisions like this will very soon actually be held responsible. And you also mentioned the judges in this case and how they feel like they'll be judged for how they're making decisions. Is that what you meant, or do you do you think that the judges should be held responsible for decisions made by the machine, or it's someone
No,
at a
no,
level
no.
up?
The person that
from that?
decided to impose scoring systems in courtrooms should be held accountable for crappy scoring system that answered the wrong question. Boris Johnson was asked about the terrible A-level algorithm, and he called it a mutant algorithm. And so all I wanted to say is prepare for the mutant invasion. Like, that's what we're going to see coming now. And like, let's hope that instead of just saying, oh, the machine said it, like it must be true, or if the machine made a mistake, it's not my fault. But the person who put that machine into the position of power is asked, why did you do that? What was the evidence that that was the right system to impose? That's what I want to see. That's what accountability means. It's like the person who chose to deploy the algorithm is held accountable for its mistakes.
I think that about wraps up the questions that we had. So I think that's a good note to leave off on. And I want to thank Kathy again for, and also everyone who's tuned in for our first Egg on Air live keynote. I'd love to invite you to join us again on Friday for our second session. Dr. Brandis Marshall will discuss closing the data science talent gap in an equitable way, which addresses a lot of the issues that Kathy kind of continues the discussion of what Kathy's talked about today. In addition to the live keynotes taking place on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, as you might know, Egg on Air is also bringing free unlimited access to content from past Egg conferences. So we encourage you to go check that out, as well as our newly launched episodes, which kicked off today with Noelle Silver, Head of Instruction, Data Science, Analytics, and Full Stack Web Development at HackerU. These sessions go more in depth with industry experts, revealing firsthand stories inspired by pressing topics in machine learning, data science, and AI, like the ones that Kathy's brought up today. So thanks again, and hopefully see everyone soon at the next session.